Welcome to the Everyday Spirituality Podcast. I'm James Hazelwood, author, bishop, and spiritual companion, bringing you interviews and information at the intersection of a gritty Christian mysticism and depth psychology. You can find all the episode show notes, as well as my free Substack newsletter, Notebooks, at jameshazelwood.net. Now, on to the show. Hello, and welcome to episode 86 of the Everyday Spirituality Podcast, or episode 5 of the second season. Today, my guest is the Episcopal priest serving Grace Church in Gainesville, Georgia, Reverend Stuart Higginbotham. He's the author of the book, The Heart of a Calling, which I highly recommend to you. It's a very tiny little book, great resource for people working in congregational life. Stuart has really put contemplative prayer and meditation at the heart of his own life, but also the life of a congregation, and we have a great conversation about that. In general news, 3 items, resources to commend you. The first is the work of Dr. Martin Shaw. Martin is a storyteller and an author. Among his many talents, he has a delightful Substack newsletter. It's both in written and audio form, and Martin Lee recently found himself immersed in the book of Job. And he has a wonderful 2-part series on that ancient book, which is quite possibly the oldest piece of literature in the Hebrew Bible. You can learn more about Martin at his website, drmartinshaw.com, drmartinshaw.com. Another person I commend to follow is Stephen Jenkinson. He is the former director of hospice and palliative care in Toronto, Canada. He's written a book called Die Wise, among several writings. He's currently on tour with the Canadian musician Gregory Hoskins, and they've put together quite an amazing evening of music and reflections on grief and mystery. You can look up that at orphanwisdom.com. Again, links in the show notes. And finally, Dr. Fanny Brewster has a new book out. It's called Race and the Unconscious, an Africanist depth psychology perspective on dreaming, and it engages the archetypal African consciousness that enriches our knowledge regarding the foundation of mythopoetic and Africanist dreaming. Dr. Brewster has written a couple of different things on the psychological underpinnings of race, and her writings are really clear and succinct. There's a book launch for this new book of hers, August 4th, 2023, and I'll put a link in the show notes. In personal updates, I want to let you know that on Wednesday evening, September 13th, 2023, I'll be joined by local musician Mike Bussey for an evening we are calling Songs and Stories of Weird Wisdom, obviously a play on the title of my most recent book. It's a combination of ancient stories and contemporary stories that I'll be telling, along with some old myths, interspersed with music that Mike and some of his musician friends will be preparing and performing. That'll be held at the Cross Mills Library in Charlestown, Rhode Island. I know for many of you that would not be possible for you to make in person. I might find a way to record that evening, either audio or video, and share it with you, but we'll see. As always, you're invited and welcome to write me. jim@jameshazelwood.net is the best way to do that. My weekly newsletter is an essay on mysticism and psychology on Substack. The most recent issue, The Soul of Money, got a lot of attention and feedback. A couple of things that people wrote I wanted to share with you. Ron wrote, quote, "Such a charged concept. Although an atheist, I think the underlying message in the New Testament is both simple and excruciating. Do not hoard wealth, spend your money in helping others in need, and trust in the divine to provide for you in the future. How difficult it is to turn away from the acquisition of money and power and find joy in service of others. I'm not there yet." Thank you, Ron. That's a wonderfully put and quite honest. Bruce wrote, years ago in a sermon, I wondered aloud whether one might think of, quote, "in God we trust," as a way of directing our focus away from lucre, or the sordid aspects of money, and back to the Holy One. Can't remember if I read that somewhere or, admittedly less likely, thought it up myself. I still like it. That's a nice perspective on In God We Trust. I hadn't thought of it that way. And finally, Marco wrote, "When taken literally and an end in itself, mammon becomes the god people worship. I grew up in a middle-class working family. My father wanted me to make more money than obtaining job satisfaction. I have been retired for some years and now have more money in our credit union than I ever had. I would exchange it all to regain my sense of smell and taste that I lost almost 4 years ago." Wow. So true. Money compared to health. So thank you for writing. You're always welcome to write me, again, at jim@jameshazelwood.net. I want to close before our conversation with Stuart with a poem by William Stafford. This is one of my favorite. It was shared with me several years ago by a spiritual director. The poem is called "The Way It Is." There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. Let's go to our conversation with Stuart Higginbotham. And he and I connected over Zoom from his home congregation in Gainesville, Georgia. Well, today I have our guest is Stuart Higginbotham. Stuart, welcome to the Everyday Spirituality Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a treat to be here, really.
Where are you right now? Because we live in this disembodied world where people will hear a recording and go, most people know I live in Rhode Island, but where are you right now?
Well, right now I'm in my office at the parish in Gainesville, Georgia, at Grace. Gainesville is a relatively small town, about 30 to 40,000, right on the edge of the Appalachian Mountains. You can see them when you drive out and get to the wide spot of the road, and right on one of the major lakes in Georgia. So it's a beautiful little spot tucked here north of Atlanta.
Sounds beautiful. Sounds beautiful indeed.
It's good.
So I wanted to talk with you because you serve as a parish priest in an Episcopal congregation, and you have a deep interest and practice in the contemplative life. And so maybe we could start with just a little bit about who you are and your background and how you became interested in this particular aspect of the Christian faith.
Oh, that's good. So I'm a bit of a hybrid in many ways. I was born in the Mississippi Delta over the bridge from Greenville, Mississippi, in that southeastern corner of Arkansas, in a devoutly Baptist family of different flavors of the Baptist school. Went to a private Presbyterian college, Lyon College, in the northern part of the state. So I began to ask a lot of questions about different denominations. And for some reason, I'm hardwired to be curious. So when I went off to school, I just started asking and wondering. Ended up leaving. I was pre-med the whole way through at undergrad, but my senior year decided not to go that route. That wasn't what I needed to do. Went to Columbia Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, which is a wonderful Presbyterian school. But midway through there, the faculty have this wonderful thing where they meet and they kind of evaluate you, and you write kind of a statement paper. And I wrote a paper that my ordination would be a sacrament. So we debated that for 2 hours because in the Presbyterian church, it's not. And so they ended up recommending that I transfer to the Episcopal diocese. So I did that. So I have this kind of very circuitous, meandering vocational path from different flavors of Baptist to Presbyterian to Episcopal. But all along that current, there's been this deep curiosity and wonder about the contemplative side of things, to put it that way. Like, what's the deeper heart within the institutional framework for me? That's really the space I've been drawn to for 20 years now, is looking at those deeper questions around how do we become more aware of that indwelling presence of God within our personal life and within our communal life.
And have you found that other people are also curious, as you've articulated your own interests along the way, whether they be members of congregations you've served or elsewhere?
I think on the whole, we are. One of the things that was really intriguing for me is there's a 2-year time span between Columbia and being ordained a priest when I served as a hospice chaplain at an inpatient unit. And those questions that people ask working those 2 years continue to be kind of a guidepost for me. And I became really curious why it was that we only wonder about that, to put it in that deeper, more substantive, indwelling presence, that sphere, when we encounter some sort of challenge or crisis. And that in a lot of ways kind of sparked the way I see parish life around. I think we do wonder. I think we do ask. We have questions. We may not have the space to ask them or the language to ask them. So sometimes it's more a question of people feeling that they're not adequately prepared, proficient. But what I found is that, given the chance, people do wonder. People do. And that to me gives parish life its life. That's kind of the beating heart of it for me.
Yeah, memento mori, the medieval practice of remember that we will die, which many people might say that's a morbid topic, but it's true, and true. has a sobering effect on many people's. I think one of the things, certainly you experienced that working in hospice, but one of the things that people in ministry, that you have to know this because you end up walking alongside people as they're entering their final days. Mm-hmm. It brings out the essential questions, the ultimate questions.
It does. And, and births do as well. Births do that. illnesses do that. You know, marriages at their best, planning a wedding, will often spark these deeper questions when people, really start planning out a longer vision of what their life can look like.
Oh, well, you've had far more positive experiences in planning weddings than I have.
I mean, notice I said at their best. I know. What?
Yes, that is true. You did qualify.
That
But
is
that's a
so
good
funny.
point. Yes, births and deaths, those kind of things that get us to, they're moments for us to start to ask those central questions
Oh
that are
yeah.
key. Now, you have done something that I think is unique, and that's you've woven these questions into a community. And you've got a little book out, The Heart of a Calling. We can talk about that in a second. But tell us a little bit about how you've woven these questions, not just individually with, say, individuals or families within a congregational setting, but the community as a whole.
Hmm. So when I was I would have been in the discernment process for this parish in 2013. That was the year that they were searching for a new rector. And one of the things that it really shows the strength of what is possible within a parish, because they asked and wondered. The parish, in our, like you as well, the parish has a choice, and the parish frames what questions that they ask, and kind of they set the tone in most ways when you first step into it and you start meeting. And I noticed that the parish in their profile was very brave and listed things that I found shocking, that a parish would be so bold. They said in there, we need to work on pastoral care. There's a perception sometimes that our parish is cold. So, right. So I went through and I circled these things and said, there is a willingness here. And if I can put my finger on those veins or those threads and kind of follow them, I wonder where that will go. So when we started talking, I was doing my DMin at the time at Sewanee. And so I wanted to focus on that intersection of contemplative practice and congregational life. That was where, I really felt my vocation finds its tap root, to put it that way. And so I brought all of that with me and said, I'm doing a deep dive in this right now. I really wonder what it would be like to kind of practice this deeper discernment and look at models, look at frameworks, and for me, how does our cultural interest in mindfulness practice, how can we take some of those pieces and kind of translate them over into a Christian context and see, that deeper root of those ancient strands of our own faith around discernment, listening, the Benedictine framework, all of those riches. And so it was this wonderful kind of 9-month process where we would have some meeting each month. And I didn't know if they would, invite me back. I would go into it and try to be, as open as I could be. And they would too. And then they would call me and I would come back. And so I would look at my wife and said, well, they've asked me to come back. And that was a fascinating kind of experience in and of itself. And it really showed me that early on, we started asking questions around how can we shift, adapt the actual leadership, decision-making framework of the parish's life. So where this sphere is not seen as just a program that, people who are kind of into that sort of thing can go over there and there's a weekend, here and a week-long thing there. But how can we actually shift the decision-making framework on that leadership level? And that's where I think the real life started to take root.
Yeah, and that is unique in my experience of congregations, that they were identifying this hunger and this need. So it sounds like it was a marriage that went well, that's going
It
well.
was a marriage. That's right. To build on that metaphor. Yes, right.
Yeah. So your interests, your desires, theirs lined up, and now for at least for 10 years, you've been doing that. I remember the first time we talked, and one of, I guess, I was falling into the programs. I had you in a class, and I was like, well, what are the programs that you did, or what was the agenda? But that's not how you led them. You were kind of hinting at that there at the end of your talk about that. Tell us a little bit about like the how and the what you and the congregation did to make this mindfulness a central aspect of the life of the congregation.
So I had a very good mentor in the two priests who I worked with and for at my last parish, Lang and Brian, and both of them had enormous strengths. And they showed me the role of the senior pastor, the senior clergy person coming into a system. And kind of that there's a common model or a common pattern of, when the senior person comes in and is new, there's kind of a both and of, let's look to him or her and see what they want to do. And then there's also some kind of pushback against that, like, who do you think you are coming in and you're new? Why do you think you can tell us what to do? And both of those kind of go on, in terms of the system itself. So when I first came in, we actually spent 6 or 7 months on Wednesday nights in a series of listening circles. And I mentioned those in my book because they were such a pivotal piece of this parish's story with me being here. And there were around 100 to 150 would meet every Wednesday night. And we would be at small groups at tables. There was a scribe at each table. And I just gave them like a guiding, a question prompt. And we went through all of the different kind of facets of the parish's life and kind of gleaned where, energy was, where we could sense the spirit at work, and where we, encountered log jams and, resistances. And I would glean those, and then I would work with a small group. And then the next week we would present that back and say, this is what we heard. And we did that back and forth for about 6 or 7 months. What came out of it was this really clear sense of, we can actually shift, in our case, the vestry and the staff structure, we can shift that to actually support and encourage and nurture where life is, versus keeping the framework that had been and saying, how do we go out and convince people to be involved in the things that we have done? And there was some deep work that needed to be done around that. And so they did it. Again, it's it showed that, it kind of there's a great William Stafford poem that says, follow the thread. Don't ever let go of that thread. And that was what we did and continue to do, because it calls for a certain nimbleness to say, how do we bless where life has been? And sometimes life moves in a different spot. How do you kind of bless that and let some things go? And also have some spiritual courage, if you will, to step into some new spaces and take risks. But that, I think, was the key link between imagination and structure.
Imagination and structure. I love that William Stafford poem on the follow the thread. I'll put that in the show notes. I remember you telling me a particularly humorous story. I wonder if you could share it about, there was a decision, I think it was around flowers.
Yes, flowers.
which is, this, on the one hand, this is just a completely trivial story, and people that really want to do a deep dive into spirituality go, what does this have to do with it? But I just love the story. Maybe you could tell it because it's just such a great example of like there are things we cling to that we need to let go of.
Yeah.
What was that happened?
So when I came in, there had been this, this custom at the parish, like there are in most, I guess, of people would take flowers to people who had been ill or, stuck in their homes and couldn't get out. And there was a group of people who had done that for years. And they would come in during the week and they would take the flowers, from the Sunday flowers, and they would break them down into smaller pieces. This went on for, probably 2 or 3 years, I guess. And then finally, the lady who chaired that had a meeting with all of them and said, it's time for me to step down from this. I really don't, I don't want to keep on doing this. So they all said, great. And so they all kind of sat there, and I said, well, who wants to kind of step in and chair it? And no one wanted to. And so I said, well, let's just let this sit because it doesn't look like anyone really wants to step into this and own it. And there was this, pushback, and they said, well, we can't just let it go because we've done this for so long, and it's such a crucial part of the parish's life. And I said, well, apparently not. Apparently, I mean, apparently something is going on. So, I mean, you all are the ones, so it has to come from you. And there was this moment where we all kind of sat there and looked at each other. And I said, well, if none of you feel led to step up and do it, I think we have to just let it sit. And that sat fallow, to put it that way, for about 3 years. 3 years until a different group of people came in one day and said, we thought about this. We haven't seen people taking flowers, and I would like to do it. And they stepped into it, reframed it, and owned it. But I mean, like you said, it is a small thing, but it is, emblematic of kind of how you hold that liminal time of that 3 years to say, I'm not going to step in and try to convince people, but I'm going to listen and see what opens up.
And I love the agricultural metaphors too, because they just apply in so many ways. Because there are aspects in our lives where we have activities, engagements, relationships, people that we know, things that we do, that they reach their end time. And we have a hard time letting those go. Yep. But maybe in letting those go, we also allow for some fallow time, and then something else is born out of it or resurrected out of it.
Yeah, I think so. And even with, the church as a whole, what we're all going through now.
Yeah.
I mean, on every level of our life.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that actually brings me to this quote that's in your book, The Heart of a Calling, on page 24. I just want to read it, these two sentences, and get your thoughts, if you could elaborate on this. The greatest challenge within the breadth of the Christian tradition is not a loss of membership or a rapid decrease in budgets or a loss of prestige or cultural sway. Rather, our greatest danger rests with a loss of spiritual imagination and the willingness to cultivate a practice of faith that harnesses the potential within our own religious tradition. That's wonderful and a little controversial, because some people are in a full-blown panic about the loss of membership, etc. Tell me a little bit more about what you were driving at there with that.
Well, I think, thank you for reading that. I mean, the lessons that I continue to learn from my team. When I came to Grace, most of my current staff was here prior to me, and they all stayed on and have been such wonderful, colleagues and partners. And the wisdom, just the institutional memory that they carry to say, these are the things we've tried, these are the things that have not worked, that have worked. And early on, we noticed that there was just this anxiety in the system to come up with a more clever idea. If we can just come up with some clever idea that no one has thought of, then we'll have 150 children next Sunday show up, and in every part of the parish's life. And we just started talking and saying, how can we take the risk to get to a deeper level that says, let's not, are we spending our time trying to develop programs that we then have to reframe, and there's this constant loop that we fall in? Or is there something deeper? And that led into, I was, fortunate at Columbia to have Walter Brueggemann as my Old Testament professor. And I remembered him in class one time talking about the Hebrew prophets. And the thing that he told us was, people, we all can only give what we have at our fingertips. What we have at our fingertips is what we have to give, things that we actually have and that we know and that we can that we can access and draw from. And he told us, he said, the role of the Hebrew prophets was to increase the imaginative capacity of the people so that they could respond to the social, political, pressures that they all felt. And that stuck with me. And I go back to that because that to me is where the deep wisdom is and what we're all facing right now. Like, we can only give what we have at our fingertips. And what we have at our fingertips, on one hand, is kind of catchphrase and shorthand language. And we have a program model. And we go back to these, and we get caught in this anxiety loop around, well, what happens whenever our really good planned out program doesn't work? And that's where I think my vocational life is drawn, is how can we actually nurture the imaginative capacity of people so that we trust the Spirit, and we kind of put our, energy there, if you will, and then respond to that, participate with that, be nimble with that, and have some movement. Yes, we need some structure that always comes, along with it. But what would it be like, and what practices can we actually use to kind of increase that capacity?
What practices do you use in yourself
Mhm.
or in the congregation?
I use sermons a good deal. I mean, we all do here. We use sermons, and we use, forums. We're starting at the parish, we started during COVID, and we're expanding this out, but we're starting the Center for Prayer and Spiritual Practice, which is kind of a holding tank to have different types of conversations. We had this great friend who's a drummer. We had friends come in last fall, or in February, come in just to spend a Saturday looking at rhythm, with a drummer, and poetry and responses. We're having a class this summer on taking different creation myths from around the world and putting them alongside each other and looking at what themes that we notice, what language that is used. We're having something in the fall that we're going to plan around the image of taking refuge, to say, how do we understand from a Christian point of view, a Buddhist point of view, like Psalm 31? How can we draw out some of this language and metaphors, and kind of invite a space around saying, have you ever wondered about this? And sermons, I think, can be used well in that way too. Just, to take risks. And we'll have people, sometimes we'll put out sheets of paper, in the pews, and say, as you listen to this sermon, write down what comes to you, and we'll put a bowl at the front when they come up for communion. Drop it down in the bowl, and then we'll take those and kind of then feed them back. It's so important, I think. And what that does is it empowers folks. It really does empower them to say, what I've wondered about is worthwhile.
Yeah, what I hear you creating is a community that's in dialogue, that it's,
Yeah.
the old model of the kind of proclamation of the gospel to the people, then the people go out into the world. And you're kind of spinning that a bit to suggest that, we're reflecting together, and you want a feedback loop, and you're being very intentional about that.
Yeah. One of the gifts we have at the parish, my associate and friend, Cynthia, is a linguist. And so we focus a lot on stories, and that's been a big piece of this parish's life that I'm really grateful for, is when people have the chance to tell their story. It is a hugely affirming piece. And then they can sit with that and notice these spaces where God has showed up in their life, and then build on that and go from that. And then they become, curious about someone else's story, which I think is a beautiful thing.
It is a beautiful thing. It also reminds me of a conversation I had with a chaplain who was working in a home for senior adults that needed attention and extra care. And oftentimes he ended up listening to stories, and people would end by saying, I've never told anyone that story.
Yeah. Well, we're taking advantage right now of our bicentennial campaign. In 4.5 years, we'll celebrate our 200th. And Cynthia is doing this wonderful thing where she is interviewing people and filming their stories, just these 10 to 15-minute kind of story booth things. And they are so rich and wonderful. And then you lay them all, alongside each other, and you look, and there's such life. People look back and go, and what I feel when that's happening is that, our shoulders go down a little bit. They, that stress that we all feel from, will we make it? I mean, on one level, and how do we deal with, the loss that we all sense is there? Well, there's also this that's there. When we start telling our stories, we're reminded, and then we become even more, aware of that presence that's always there.
Lovely. So in addition to where you serve, you're also going to be doing some teaching. Tell us a little bit about that.
So this fall, I'll rotate on the faculty at Candler School of Theology at Emory, and I'll be teaching Wednesday afternoons to the Episcopal track students. There's a track of Episcopal students. They're all dressed very well, and we always walk with incense in front. I know. But I have it'll be.
I do that same thing for the Lutherans, only it's usually with a beer stein, and
the beer stein, and those wonderful, and you sing "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," right? But it's going to be such a treat, to do this, because part of it is working with them over 3 years, once each week, and this will be, So when I met with the deans and they asked me to do this, they said, well, how would you kind of come at it if you had an overarching image or framework? And I said, well, what if we really did, spend some time, and I just threw it out to them. And I said, what if we created a laboratory for spiritual imagination, where people who are studying to be clergy, can actually develop these skills or tools, nurture this part of ourself that we can trust more, so that when we step into our parishes and whatever comes through our doors and lands on our desks, we can go back, if you will, to that grounding piece of, this really is true. This really is good. I can trust that indwelling, presence. So that's what we're going to try to do. We're going to weave in, some poetry they'll have their Sunday placements like, we all do when we're in school. And then we'll come back each week and just listen and share stories and do some deeper reflection work.
Sounds great. A great gift to those people. Yeah. Well, wonderful. This has been a great conversation. Where can we point people to if they want to learn more about you or what you do, or some of the various projects, including this Center for Prayer and Spiritual Practice that you're starting?
You can always go to Grace Episcopal Church's website, and there's also kind of a landing site that I've set up for the past few years called contemplativereformation.com. And that's where I tuck a lot of writings, some poetry and different pieces there. So between those two, you can find kind of some stepping stones if you want to, read more and dig in.
Great. Wonderful. And of course, there's your book, The Heart of a Calling, which is subtitled The Practice of Christian Mindfulness in a Congregational Ministry.
Yeah.
And I think it might have been through the endorsement on the back of this by Vincent Pizzuto that led me to his excellent book,
such a wonderful
Christ.
guy. Yeah. I mean, he's doing such wonderful work out on the West Coast.
Yeah, makes me want to plan an excuse to go visit my brother who lives in San Francisco, and then connect with Vincent at some time. Thank you so much, Stuart. This has been a lovely conversation.
Thank you for this. Thank you very, very much.